This is our graduate student symposium in the history of art. It is, I say this every year because it's true, it's our favorite program of the year. This symposium is now in its 29th year, and it's one of the premier forums for up-and-coming scholars in the field. For us, for me and my colleagues at the Barnes, we truly relish this opportunity to connect with students and with their mentors, and to spend a full day hearing about new ideas and new research. And I do not say this lightly. You may have noticed that we're living through a time when the very idea of research and the production of knowledge is under attack, with a White House that is openly hostile to higher education. We want you to know that the Barnes is committed to being an incubator for intellectually adventurous work and to celebrating the kind of human creativity that will be on display. And I just want to say, I personally, and I know my colleagues feel the same way, I'm just very, very grateful for the community that we have here. Our speakers today come from 9 of the top PhD programs in the area and have been nominated by their departments. Today's talks will explore a diverse range of methodologies and topics, from the afterlives of medieval liturgical books to strategies of interruption in contemporary video art. Thank you to our 9 speakers for bringing new questions to the history of art. We look forward to hearing your papers today. Thank you to everyone in the audience for being here. Thank you to people online for tuning in. Thank you to the students and to their advisors for traveling to be with us today, and to our co-organizing institutions, University of Pennsylvania, Temple University, and Bryn Mawr. Thank you to Christiane Gruber for her wonderful talk last night, very thought-provoking. And if you didn't get a chance to hear it last night, we will, Aaliyah, tell me if I'm right about this. It will be eventually, probably in a week, available to see on YouTube. It was a really beautiful and important talk. Thank you, as always, to our wonderful AV team for their professionalism, their great colleagues, and last but not least, to the amazing Aaliyah Palumbo, our manager of adult education and academic programs, for organizing this whole event and for attending to every detail with such care. And all of you who worked with Aaliyah in the months leading up to this, you know how much goes into this and how she was just kind of on top of it at all times. Thank you, Aaliyah. So now I will turn it over to Jennifer Stager, Assistant Professor of the History of Art at Johns Hopkins University, to introduce her student, our first speaker, Ella Gonzalez.
Thank you. It is my great pleasure to introduce Ella Gonzalez, a PhD candidate in her 6th year in the History of Art department at Johns Hopkins, where she is currently an Alexander Grass Humanities Institute pre-doctoral fellow, an honor for a select group of PhD candidates in the humanities who are in the final stages of writing their dissertations. Ella's talk today draws on her dissertation, which is entitled Bearing Weight, Caryatids and Women's Labor in Ancient Greek Art, a work that deftly weaves together histories of ancient Mediterranean art and feminism through a close analysis of the ubiquitous yet understudied caryatids, or load-bearing, female-presenting supports. Ella's meticulous research has been supported by a summer fellowship for the program in Women, Gender, and Sexuality in 2021, a summer fellowship from the American School of Classical Studies in 2022, and a Fulbright fellowship which took her to Athens for the academic year of 2023-2024. While there, in addition to this research, Ella, characteristically, also studied modern Greek and volunteered as a grant writer for Action for Women, an organization supporting refugees and asylum seekers. a pairing of research and practice that Ella continuously models. In November 2023, Ella published a public-facing essay drawing from her research, Individual Collectives, Collective Individuals, a bronze caryatid mirror from the Walters Art Museum, as part of the folio Locating a Collective Lyric Eye for the Hopkins Review. This essay, which she chose to publish in an open access wing of the folio, was immediately cited by scholars in the field, including in a recent catalog of work by Francesca Woodman. In my years as Ella's advisor, I have observed firsthand Ella's rigorous method, wide-ranging curiosity, and intellectual fire. In addition to her dissertation research, she has written about Niobe through the lens of feminist mythological revisionist history, drawing on work of Hélène Cizou and Adrienne Rich, work which she has presented at the 7th Feminist Art History Conference in 2021. Prior to her joining the department, I had come to know Ella's work through the publication of her important article, co-authored with Cynthia Coburn, How to Teach Ancient Art in the Age of Me Too, which appeared in Hyperallergic in 2018. This article, which has reached a wide public, changed the language that I choose to use in the classroom when discussing the many images of ancient Mediterranean art that depict sexual violence. Published while still an undergraduate, Ella and Cynthia subsequently co-organized a robust 2019 College Art Association panel on the same question, applied to all subfields of the history of art. Building on this work, Ella, Cynthia, and their collaborator, Ellen Caldwell, have edited Gender Violence, Art and the Viewer, which came out this fall with Penn State University Press, a book that will have significant scholarly impact, and for which Ella and her co-editors received the Millard Mice Award from College Art Association, and on which Ella just presented last week at CAA in New York. With a background in art history and journalism, Ella is deeply committed to communicating beyond disciplinary boundaries. As a student in my research-driven seminar, the Antioch Recovery Project, Ella and another graduate student researched the many locations, including here in Philadelphia, to which mosaic pavements from the ancient city of Antioch have been dispersed in modernity. And they produced, using the same software that was being used to track the spread of COVID-19, ArcGIS, an open source interactive map of all modern locations known to us of these ancient mosaics. Ella, I, and another graduate student presented this work at the Peopling the Past 2023 colloquium, and our collaboratively written essay, Research-Driven Pedagogy and Public-Facing Outcomes, appears in the open access volume, Ancient Pasts for Modern Audiences. As the field of ancient Mediterranean art, like its adjacent field of classics, confronts the ongoing mobilization of its historical objects and texts by white supremacists, and the deployment of neoclassical styles in the service of right-wing ideology, Ella has already begun to forge important change. For example, she's part of a team of researchers working with Dr. Sanchita Balachandran on the Mellon-supported project Excavating the History of the Archaeological Museum, Racism and Repair in the Modern Academy, analyzing the integral role of collecting, teaching, and exhibiting archaeological materials in the production and dissemination of racist ideologies. In addition to her commitment to feminist practices, the intersections of academic and public-facing scholarship, and writing the often invisible histories of women and non-binary people back into our stories of ancient Mediterranean art, Ella is an exceptional colleague. It is my very great pleasure to invite her to the podium to share her work with all of us today.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Jen, for that really kind and generous introduction. Caryatids, sculpted female supports that hold up buildings like the Erechtheion on the Athenian Acropolis, the treasuries of the Greek islands of Knidos and Sifnos at Delphi, and even modern structures, like Philadelphia's City Hall, visibly show their labor. They support, hold, elevate, and buttress. These sculpted women, among the most recognizable forms of Greek sculpture, have been investigated in terms of their typologies or their etymology. In the 1st century BCE, the Roman architect Vitruvius wrote in Latin that architectural caryatids represented women from Caria in the Peloponnese, whom the Greeks enslaved because they sided with the Persians in the Persian Wars. Scholars acknowledge that the Greeks referred to such sculptures by an entirely different term, chorai, or maidens. like the freestanding sculpture type. However, the weighty and pejorative caryatid, with its reference to enslaved labor, still adheres to these objects. Today, I want to turn to caryatids at the Panhellenic sanctuary at Delphi in Greece, the earliest architectural caryatids on the Greek mainland. The sanctuary developed around the 8th century BCE and reached its acme in the 6th century BCE. Most significantly, Delphi was home to the famed Pythia, or oracle, and pilgrims from all over the Greek world traveled to seek her advice. In addition to the Temple of Apollo and the treasuries of Greek city-states that housed votives or gifts to the gods, two of which had caryatids holding up their porches, Delphi was the site of dedicatory portraits of famous ancient Greek courtesans, known as hetairae, who are also high-class prostitutes in ancient Greece. Although these statues are no longer extant and only exist in ancient textual remnants, this paper reinserts them into the Delphic landscape. I read courtesan portraits in conversation with the 6th century BCE caryatids that supported the roofs of the Siphnian and Cnidian treasuries. The caryatids and courtesan portraits both perform essential labor, literally and metaphorically, for the sanctuary. The caryatids mirror the dedicatory acts of pilgrims through their gesture, evoking the necessary maintenance of the sanctuary, and in the case of the courtesan portraits, promoting competition among the polis, or city-states. These women's dedicatory portraits would have been conspicuous monuments visible from various vantage points of the sanctuary. Through dialogue with the caryatids, whose laboring bodies hold up porches of treasuries and mirror the dedicatory acts of pilgrims, while also alluding to the competitive nature of polis-based dedications, I propose that such sculptures and dedications express the essential but at times invisible nature of women's labor in antiquity. My paper centers the caryatids, whose physical remnants are still left, as a lens for looking at courtesan portraits and dedications, which form a smaller portion of this talk, but are linked through their shared labor at the site. During the sanctuary's peak activity, pilgrims offer votives to Apollo at Delphi, known as the navel or omphalos of the earth, after Zeus, seeking the world's center, sent two eagles from opposite ends of the earth. They crossed paths over Delphi, where he placed a stone. And this is a marble replica from the Hellenistic or Roman period of this omphalos. The sanctuary is enveloped by Mount Parnassus, which hugs the complex closely with its glittering limestone rocks. A pair of these cliffs are called the Phaedriades, or Shining Ones, further animating the landscape. The site's main draw was the Pythia, the famed priestess whose cryptic riddles and the vapors beneath her tripod inspired lore that often eclipsed the realities of Delphi and the Pythia herself. The Pythia was also the focus of the 19th century imagination, with paintings and art inspired by her lore. Pilgrims to Delphi, seeking the Pythia's advice, offered gifts that were neither purely for the gods nor entirely altruistic. These offerings were also competitive and conspicuous displays of wealth, prestige, and politics, vehicles for competition among the Greek city-states that touted their superiority in the guise of performative piousness. To serve this goal, treasuries belonging to these city-states cropped up along the sacred way, the path leading up to the sanctuary, to accommodate the pilgrims' dedications. The artistic choices and decorations of these treasuries also served these aims. One of the earliest treasuries at the sanctuary, the Siphnian treasury, was constructed around 525 BCE. The Siphnian treasury was erected to house the votive offerings for the island of Sifnos, noted for its extravagant wealth because of its gold and silver mines and exploitation of enslaved labor for these purposes. Most significant to us are the two caryatids of Parian marble that held up the porch of the west facade of this building. Only the upper portion of the torso of one of the caryatids survives, wearing a kalathos or tall headdress. the extant caryatid is not visually dissimilar to the archaic chori or maidens produced contemporaneously. The caryatid has almost no facial expression, much like other chori. Her torso is draped, and both arms are missing. Holes in her ears and hair indicate that metal attachments were probably originally added, such as earrings and a headpiece, echoing the glittering rocks of Mount Parnassus. While both of the caryatid's arms are missing, the pair of caryatids have been reconstructed as holding one hand forward with the fruit and pulling their dress with their other hand. This reconstruction by the 19th century Danish architect Erik Hansen shows the Siphnian caryatids extending their left and right hands, offering a piece of fruit, perhaps as a gift for a god. A more recent reconstruction in 2019 by John Goodinson maintains this form, but animates the treasury's caryatids with an interpretation of color that would have accompanied the structure in ancient times. On the more fantastical side, the Siphnian treasury in the 2018 Ubisoft video game Assassin's Creed Odyssey imagines the structure with half-naked caryatids. Their right hands are extended slightly forward in a semi-offering gesture, but unlike the previous reconstructions, their palms are devoid of any visible offerings. Richard Neer argues that by bearing offerings on a building that houses gifts, these caryatids model normative behavior for the men and women who offer gifts that will be housed in the very treasury where the caryatids are positioned. The strangeness of having women, a class of individuals in ancient Greece who are routinely said to have fewer rights compared to citizen men, is remarked upon by Neer. I want to suggest that women as the paradigm for prospective dedicants is not as strange as it might seem, and that this motif appeared in numerous other media, from vase painting to freestanding chori, and even in caryatid mirrors, that modeled this same dedicatory motif, albeit on a much smaller scale. Perhaps what was ultimately so strange about the caryatids was the conspicuousness of their dedicatory nature, but this conspicuousness matched the very aspirations of the monument itself. Unlike a chori, which was freestanding and not built into a structure, the gesture of the caryatids on the Siphnian treasury, if we're to subscribe to the reconstructions, explicitly hints at what is contained within, and the purpose of the very building on which they are embedded. There is no subtlety in their architectural incorporation. But the Siphnian treasury was not the only building with caryatids. Before it was even created, caryatids also supported the porch of the Cnidian treasury. This earlier treasury was constructed between 565 and 555 BCE for the island of Knidos. Central to the caryatid's significance is the weight that they bear, a weight that confers duties, obligations, and work through cathected viewing with the beholder. One fragment, on the right, consists of a headless torso that shows a right arm grasping at drapery that radiates from the side. The caryatid also wears a calathos and also has holes for decorative metal attachments, like a diadem and earrings. We can perhaps imagine that they were positioned similarly to those reconstructed on the Siphnian treasury, extending their hand with a votive offering. Reconstructions of the Cnidian treasury tend not to recreate the arms and attributes that they may have held. For instance, this reconstruction tends to be reproduced, yet on it there's no indication of what they may have held in their hands. However, based on visual comparanda of both the reconstructions of the Siphnian treasury and contemporary chori, we can surmise that the caryatids of the Cnidian treasury also held some attributes as an explicit visual signal of the contents held within the treasury and the proper way of offering dedications. In a dedicatory inscription relating to the building's construction, the Cnidian caryatids are referred to as agalmata, a term used for statues of gods, but also meaning glory, delight, or honor. In comparison, there is no known name for the caryatids on the Siphnian treasury. The term not only emphasizes the caryatid's votive role, but also encapsulates the emotional and visual impact of their labor, aligning it with the Treasury's competitive function. Based on this competitive aspect and interpolis competition, I propose that the figural columns were part and parcel of and even facilitated this competition. What better way to engage your polis to donate and promote competition among them than by incorporating gendered human bodies that show the very activities that dedicants were to perform? Indeed, we might even take this connection between the Caryatids on the treasuries and this theme of labor further by emphasizing that the Caryatids indexed and visualized the very work that went into both maintaining and creating these treasuries. The building of these structures, their maintenance, the cleaning, sweeping, etc., that was essential for their very existence, but so too an invisible labor, concealed behind the Caryatids' seemingly effortless demeanor. For the remainder of this talk, I will transition to the images of courtesans, or hetairai, also at Delphi, whose dedications are now rendered invisible by time, and how they engage in dialogue with the Caryatids through the attending labor they perform. Considering that not all architects or designers of treasuries made this aesthetic choice of incorporating Caryatids, this architectural move was a deliberate decision rather than a purely decorative conceit. But these objects did not exist in a vacuum. Rather, they directly impacted the experiences of those with whom they came in contact. In addition to the oracle, women's presence at Delphi was seen more literally through monumental portraiture. However, these remnants only survive from textual descriptions rather than physical or material evidence. By putting these now lost monuments in dialogue with the Caryatids, we can see how the visible labor of the Caryatids leads to investigating more invisible forms of women's labor. Akin to the Caryatids, who modeled appropriate dedicatory behavior and evoked both dedication and physical labor, the hetairai, or courtesans, whom these portraits represent or honor, also performed essential labor, both in the context of the sanctuary through dedications of their portrait statues, and more broadly through providing entertainment at symposia, or all-male drinking parties. The famed Greek courtesan Phryne from Thespiae, who was said to be the model and inspiration for Praxiteles' 4th century BCE Aphrodite of Knidos, had a gilded and therefore highly visible portrait statue, although it's no longer extant. The statue, which has not been found, was presumably placed near the entrance of the Temple of Apollo and purportedly stood between portraits of famous male rulers, including King Archidamus III of Sparta and Philip II of Macedon. The sculpture sat on a high column, and its gilding would have further amplified its visibility and drawn a visual link between the Caryatids on treasuries, enhanced even more so by their now lost glittering earrings and other attachments. Like the Caryatids, also described as agalmata, or glory or delight, textual sources indicate that Phryne's statues were described using the same word. Rhodopis, a courtesan from Thrace in Asia Minor, dedicated bronze spits, or cooking instruments that were used for roasting sacrificial animals' organs, to the sanctuary, which were monumentalized through an inscribed statue base, which is no longer extant and from the 6th century. A dedication by a wealthy Aetolian woman, not a hetairai, Aristoneta, offers further evidence of women's monumental dedications at Delphi, 100 years after Phryne. Aristoneta's monument was placed in a prominent position on the road leading from the sanctuary's entrance to the Temple of Apollo. The monument had statues of Aristoneta, her parents, and her son on 2 tall Ionic columns about 30 feet above ground. As Laura McClure has noted, by the 4th century BCE, women increasingly made dedications of portrait statues in sanctuaries, and such dedications were a testament to the immense wealth and influence of the hetairai, wealth that was acquired through their labor. Moreover, later, during the Hellenistic and Roman periods, women became benefactresses in Delphi and received honors in the form of statues set up in conspicuous places. These women's portrait statues and dedications would have been highly visible monuments that could have been seen from various vantage points. The monument's gilding would have intensified this and thus captured the attention of individuals even more so, while the statue's height, as Laura McClure has noted, would have linked these statues to divinity. Although ranging from 200 to 300 years later than the Caryatids, the combination of a female presenting statue on a column may have invoked a similar visual experience. However, unlike Caryatids, these portrait statues were not structurally supporting anything but the dedicant's ambitions and desires to be remembered in perpetuity. The monumental female portraiture accomplished a similar aim as the Caryatids by modeling this kind of behavior expected of prospective dedicants, albeit on a different scale. Dedicating a statue also served the objective of conspicuous wealth and competition for the others passers-by, whereas the Caryatids accomplished a comparable goal of demonstrating dedicatory behavior and reproducing its gestures for pilgrims. To conclude, my goal in putting these statues of Caryatids and courtesans into conversation is to highlight the connections between these sculptural types and the labor they perform, mimic, and reproduce. This comparison between the labor these sculptures perform and index is heightened by the visual similitude that would have been created through the statues of courtesans on high columns and women as columns in the case of the Caryatids. The Caryatids, which picture women dedicating objects and parallel the act of dedicating gifts in the sanctuary, are further reflected in the statues of courtesans, which are some of these very gifts that were dedicated. The Caryatid form is a metaphor for visualizing and excavating other forms of women's labor, such as the hetairai. Part of this endeavor also reinserts these sculptures back into the landscape, not as fragments in museums and storerooms, or even mere textual remnants, but as active participants in the labor and maintenance of the sanctuary. When I made my own pilgrimage to Delphi in January 2024 and ascended the Sacred Way, these fragments of sculpture reinserted themselves back into the landscape, guiding my journey. So too could I imagine and see how the modern bodies of tour groups and visitors intersected with the experiences of those in the past. The laboring bodies of the past, both visible and invisible, are reflected in the bodies of those present. Thank you so much.
I'm not homemaking, in case that was a question for anyone. I'm going to do my best to introduce Hilde in her absence. She woke up not feeling well this morning. I'm Lisa Saltzman, and I've taught Hilde too, so I think I can get away with this. Hilde is a PhD candidate in the Department of History of Art at Bryn Mawr College. Her research focuses on contemporary time-based media. She holds an MA from Williams College and a bachelor's degree from the University of Chicago, where she graduated Phi Beta Kappa and won the Lillian Gertrude Seltz Prize. Her writing has been published in various museum catalogs, and she has delivered talks at the Princeton Art and Archaeology Graduate Symposium, the University of Oregon Graduate Symposium, the University of British Columbia Symposium in Art History and Visual Art, and elsewhere. She interned at Creative Time in New York and has performed curatorial work with the Incubation Series in Philadelphia and at the Dallas Museum of Art, where she worked with artists including Alex Katz, Sheila Hicks, Wanda Coop, Guadalupe Rosales, Tiffany Chung, Matthew Wong, and Jatavia Gary, the artist who is the subject of her talk today, which is entitled Other Than What Is Given, Interrupted Visuality in Jatavia Gary's The Giverny Suite. So please join me in welcoming Hilde to the stage.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and to Homay in absentia. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to the Barnes for putting this together, especially Aaliyah. I know this is a huge labor of love, hopefully. Thank you to my peers at Bryn Mawr. I appreciate all the feedback you've given me on this talk. And finally, I wanted to thank Jatavia Gary not only for the work, but for her generosity of time and resources, which have immeasurably improved this research. So, without further ado. A canted angle medium shot opens in near focus, almost impressionist in its haziness, the curving branches of a weeping willow and indistinct mass of greenery in the background. The focus shifts to reveal a woman standing on the other side of the pond, framed by the arc of the willow branches. She is filmmaker and video artist Jatavia Gary, and the garden in which she appears and disappears that of Giverny, the famed home of Impressionist Claude Monet, as rendered on the screen in her 2019 work, The Giverny Suite. The Giverny Suite is a 3-channel video installation featuring a central channel adorned in white frames, a central channel with a screen adorned in white frames, 2 side channels set at oblique angles, an upset settee, and 2 altars placed in wall niches at the outermost edge of the arrangement. My description of the installation elements is based on the work's exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York from September 2023 to September 2024. The central channel of the Giverny Suite exists in another form as the single-channel video, the Giverny Document, also from 2019. Given this work's multiple iterations, a few points of clarification for this talk. When single images are shown in my presentation, those are drawn from the central channel and are present in both the Giverny Suite and the Giverny Document. When 3 images are shown, these represent the 3 channels of the Giverny Suite and are derived from the viewing copy, which the artist generously allowed me to access. While this viewing copy has allowed me to examine the video component itself in great detail, I want to stress that this is not the way a viewer would encounter the work. They would access the Giverny Suite as a sensorious, multi-component installation, like you see here. By bringing together myriad media in the Giverny Suite, archival, documentary, experimental, analog, digital, animated, Gary interrogates the ways that Black women and femmes are rendered simultaneously invisible and hypervisible. I argue that in the Giverny Suite, Gary enacts a mode of cinematic fugitivity through interruptive filmic techniques. These formal strategies both evidence and rupture an aesthetic regime which makes coherent and is made coherent by the patriarchal and anti-Black negation of Black women. Deploying these techniques, the glitch, the rack focus, the jump cut, direct animation, to optically and sonically break the sutured coherence of the screen, Gary creates pockets of denied visibility into which Black women can escape. The term out of field is used to describe what exists outside of the film's frame, what is unseen but remains present. We might think of the out of field as that something else that exists alongside and around the film beyond its grasp. Gary's disappearance points to that out of field, that place in time that remains unknown, inaccessible, and unrepresented. I suggest that this out of field is an otherwise. Otherwise, in the words of Ashon T. Crawley, signifies the possibility of, quote, things existing other than what is given, end quote. This, to my mind, is the most powerful interruption that Gary offers. Quote, placing us in the frame is one thing, and then there's the idea of completely exploding the frame, right? Gary has said. In the Giverny Suite, Gary's resistant figure, flickering between perceptibility and opacity, gestures to the precarity of that frame, to puncture it, even if for a moment, to invite it an otherwise for Black women. Before I turn to a formal reading of these interruptive techniques, I want to briefly lay out the theoretical and historical terrain of cinematic visuality into which Gary is intervening. In Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American grammar book, Hortense Spillers describes how associations of Black reproductivity and labor with chattel slavery mark Black women as sites for the projection of imaginaries that threaten their autonomy. She writes, quote, I describe a locus of confounded identities, a meeting ground of investments and privations in the national treasury of rhetorical wealth. My country needs me, and if I were not here, I would have to be invented, end quote. In the Giverny suite, Gary illustrates how these imaginaries and investments manifest through cinematic language, whether through feature film, the newsreel, or documentary footage. Gary includes excerpts of Josephine Baker performing in a massive birdcage from the 1934 French film Zouzou. The close-up and medium shots situate Baker as an exotic object enveloped by her extravagant feathered costume, the bars of the cage foregrounded as she belts a wistful song about who will give her back her country, her only paradise, Haiti. Though the clip appears in the Giverny suite without its original sound, this reference to Haiti, when Zouzou is, in fact, Martinican, is indicative of a particular resonance in the French imagination between Blackness and Haiti, one predicated largely, we might presume, on a fascination with Haiti as a symbol of Black radicality. This fascination and anxiety is re-articulated through Gary's use of footage from the 1963 newsreel Turbulent Haiti, a piece of anti-communist propaganda produced during the reign of brutal dictator Francois Papadoc Duvalier and now housed with the CIA records in the National Archives. Ostensibly an ethnographic travelogue, Turbulent Haiti depicts the nation and its tradition of carnival celebration and performances with high angles and tracking shots. And a tracking shot in film terms is when a camera follows along with its subject. So here in the left channel, you can see that the camera is filming from the passenger seat of a moving vehicle. The affiliation of these techniques with surveillance is further emphasized through the intercutting of bird's eye footage of Obama-era drone strikes on targets in Syria. Gary also echoes these cinematic postures of state control and their attendant sense of violent unease with high-angle tracking drone shots of herself walking through Central Park that appear on the two side channels. These stand in distinction to the inclusion of the intimate low-angle close-up video filmed and streamed to Facebook Live by Diamond Reynolds in the aftermath of the police slaying of her boyfriend Philando Castile on July 6, 2016. By urgently engaging with online viewers through her own phone camera, Reynolds provided a counter-narrative and illuminated the mechanisms by which state violence is expressed. This intervention is what Sylvia Wynter calls a deciphering practice, which here interrogates how aesthetics function to subject Black women to scopic control and consumption. Another moment of deciphering unfolds in a passage nearly 30 minutes into the Giverny suite, in which the editing reaches a point of frenzy. Gary juxtaposes Reynolds' frantic fears about Castile's condition with a chaotic burst of scratching digital noise layered over a version of Louis Armstrong's 1950 rendition of La Vie en Rose that has been slowed and stuttered in the chopped and screwed style of Houston hip-hop. The pixels of the screen disintegrate, the picture stretching and distorting as if magnetized. As the cacophony of screeching beeps, swirling petals, and flashing lights and glitching images reaches its climax, we see Gary on a bridge over Monet's lily ponds. She releases a primal scream. "Not okay," we hear Reynolds say. By threatening to tear apart the very stuff of the screen, Gary gestures to film and video's fundamental reliance on an aesthetics of capture and the representation of Black pain. But Gary's interruptive strategies are not reducible to a single eruptive event. Rather, her own appearances in the Giverny suite, sprinting down a footpath, wandering in an orchard, crossing over the Japanese footbridge, and the space of the garden itself, are characterized by cinematic techniques that destabilize the visual field and offer modes of disappearance, namely the rack focus and jump cut. Gary often deploys the rack focuses in her medium close-up shots of the flora of Giverny, whether they be of lush clusters of apples or wildflowers gently swaying in an open field. The shot will usually open in variable focus, the near and deep planes of the flame blurry while the middle portion retains clarity, before shifting, sometimes nearly imperceptibly, either bringing the entire shot into focus or clarifying another segment. So here, the shot opens with that yellow lily in the foreground in focus, and then within the same shot, the focus shifts to bring that red flower in the background into focus. That's a rack focus. Such shots create the impression of a world in flux, revealing and concealing itself in fits and starts. After establishing this visual language of focal fluidity, Gary deploys the rack focus to striking effect to bring herself in and out of sharp visibility. In a segment near the video's conclusion, a thrumming, droning tone scores a medium shot of an arbor of greenery that opens in near focus. Gary enters the frame from off-screen and begins walking through the arbor as a second tone note intensifies the sound. Gary progresses along the path and disappears into the blur, her form becoming indistinct. She stops and turns around to face the camera, which slowly rack focuses. As Gary comes into focus, the machinic sound cuts, the camera lingering in the silence on her visible, if distanced, form. Such elusive appearance is echoed in Gary's use of the jump cut. And a jump cut, to put it very simply, is when a shot is broken with a cut that makes it appear as if a sequence has jumped in time, as if frames are missing. In a segment near the beginning of the loop, a static, deep focus long shot of a small orchard, scored by low rumblings that at times seem to drink or breathe, shows Gary rising from a squat. A jump cut to a near-focus shot of the same orchard. Oops. Gary has disappeared. But there she has reappeared in the right channel, walking from screen left to right. A series of further jump cuts show Gary appearing in different parts of the orchard, seeming to teleport at will. The frame cannot contain her as she wanders through time and space, moving around and through the central channel to the flanking channels. But to what extent are these interventions liberatory? It is telling that the glitching breakdown of the screen that I discussed earlier ends with the picture correcting and the sound quieting. As Gary has said, quote, "It is about the repetition, the loop, as much as it is about the break," end quote. But while I share Gary's ambivalence about the extent to which disappearance can be emancipatory, I am interested in how she seizes this momentary break to gesture to the capacious unknown, to an elsewhere in which such a racial regime of aesthetics does not hold purchase. This gesture is perhaps nowhere so acute as in the passages of direct animation that open and close the Giverny suite, providing the connective tissue that allows the loop of the video to flow. Here, Gary has directly etched in and drawn on the celluloid itself, physically inscribing the film strips with glyphs and patterns that transform the material surface of the image. As Shirley Ann Lee's rollicking gospel song, "How Can I Lose," plays, drawings of fish, diamonds, nets, and hearts riotously dance over pink-tinted archival footage of rivers, deltas, waterfalls, and shorelines. Though the image of the water is, in some ways, indelibly tied to its resonances with enslavement, the Middle Passage, the ship, the hold, and the wake, these sequences also encode a kind of freedom and flight, with images of birds and boats swirling over the background of the flowing water as Lee asks, "How can I lose with the help of God?" In the second passage of direct animation that closes the video, several of the swirling and vibrating hand-drawn symbols reference Adinkra, a tradition associated with the Akan people in modern-day Ghana. Often appearing as cloth patterns, Adinkra symbols present a complex lexicon of proverbs, people, and logos. In the Giverny suite, these symbols invoke the strength and spiritualism of women. The concentric circles, Adinkra Hene, for greatness. the doubled hearts, Asaseyuduru, for the divinity of Mother Earth. The comb, Juafe, for beauty and feminine qualities. They shimmer across the screen, talismanic and animate. Not only do these Adinkra symbols serve as threads to the African diaspora, but they also gesture towards a departure, a dissipation, a transmutation. For the Asante people, Adinkra means saying goodbye to one another. Gary sees divination as central to her practice. Divination, in this sense, is not only forward-looking, but an act of seeing beyond and through, encompassing pasts and futures as intimately linked. A practitioner of Lukumi, a religious tradition derived from Yoruba beliefs, Gary is deeply invested in connections to ancestors and those to come, relationships that transcend death. The invocation of these others, the belief in forces and spirits that envelop and transcend the here and the now, is made material in the Giverny suite through 2 altars to Orishas, or Yoruba deities, installed on small floor pedestals in niches near the gallery entrances and flanking the side channels. So I'm bringing back this image just to show you that the altars would be just to the left and right of this image. They're in the out of field of this installation photograph, so to speak. Dedicated to Oshun, the goddess of fertility, wealth, and healing, and Yamaya, the fortune teller, goddess of the river, and mother of all Orishas, the altars are resplendent with shells, platters of fruit, candles, jars of honey, and vases of sunflowers and hydrangeas arranged across flowing cloths of yellow and blue, anchored by mirrors that reflect the screens like portals. Not only do these altars reverberate with the direct animations to spiritually call to the beyond, but they transform the Giverny suite itself into a mode of divination. They explode the frame to allow the film to spill out, excessive of the screen in the care for and attention to the presences that dwell amongst and around us in the out of field of the otherwise. Thank you.
All right, and thank you for those 2 wonderful papers to start us off. I'm going to be introducing our final speaker, Nikki Amzer. My name is Alpesh Patel. I'm an associate professor of global contemporary art at Temple University. So Nikki received her MA in art history from American University, and she's recently published in Art Journal Open and has an essay titled Iconoclastic Placemaking in Nugent Smith's Bundle House series that's been accepted for Anthurium, a Caribbean Studies journal. And you and Dr. Gruber are going to have tons to talk about with iconoclasm. Several grants have supported her research, including ones from the Huntington Library, Yale University's Lewis Walpole Library, the Colonial Historical Society, and the University of Michigan's Clemens Library, among several others. She was the only PhD candidate invited to participate in a week-long intensive workshop organized by Stanford University in collaboration with the David Rumsey Map Center on new methods and tools for critical storytelling with maps. Nikki has chaired or delivered papers as part of numerous conference panels. A title of a recent one she co-chaired is Rebellious Creating, Opacity as Praxis in the Contemporary Caribbean. She's also done an incredible amount of service for the College Art Association as well as Temple. She's a liaison with the annual conference committee and co-chairs the Student and Emerging Professional Committee. And just last week at CAA, she chaired 4 sessions, 3 of which were tied to teaching and undergraduate research, and the 4th was on fair use. On April 1st, Nikki will be defending her dissertation that's titled Disordering the Land, Visual and Material Strategies of Creating Futurity and the Otherwise in Contemporary Caribbean Art. Today, Nick will be presenting a paper, Arrivals and Departures, Ebony G. Batterson's Excessive and Otherwise Bodies, that's based on one of her chapters of her dissertation. I wanted to just end to say, I feel like I'm actually introducing a colleague. I'll be citing Nikki in my forthcoming book, so please help me welcome Nikki to the stage.
Thank you, Alpesh, and thank you so much, Aaliyah, the Barnes, for putting this together, and thank you to everyone else presenting. You will notice a lot of resonances between my paper and Hilde's paper. They have a lot of shared ideas and themes, so hopefully you will learn more about very similar topics, although I will be talking about a different medium today. So, a lamentation, a mourning, a protective funerary shroud for Black bodies who were not afforded the same right or luxury in life. Picturesque gardens, mimicking those found in Europe, were forced upon the Caribbean landscape in an effort to tame the unruly biologic material and shape it into something recognizable for European settlers and tourists. Ebony G. Patterson's gardenscape installations and interventions attend to the multi-layered, knotty histories of Caribbean land, told through and on the nameless and often faceless Black bodies and hidden within the landscape, exposing the ways in which colonial and imperial regimes never intended the colonialized subject to survive. Patterson's Buried Again to Carry On Growing, part of a 2015 multi-gallery installation at the Museum of Art and Design in New York, reimagined items from the jewelry collection alongside faux poisonous plants. Within the museum's Tiffany Gallery, Patterson placed flowers inside the standard museum vitrines, overshadowing the small glittering pieces of jewelry, markers of wealth and objects of status, barely perceptible in life as in death, a body. Their difference marked by the whiteness of their suit and its brilliant blue pops of color, brocade flowers, and a blinged out belt. And that's what you see here. Indigenous and African informants have always been a crucial source of knowledge of the land and its plants. Archival records from colonizers confirm that they learned techniques to distill antidotes of poison from the colonized subjects. Patterson's curation of plants at MAD echoes this. Nestled within the vitrines, yet in plain sight, are these kind of plants. We see Gloriosa superba, Anthurium, Strelitza, and Hilconia, all of which are poisonous plants native to the Caribbean or Africa, and also strikingly beautiful, as you can see here. Many of these can be used to both harm and heal, and that power rests with those who hold knowledge of and from the land. Patterson's interventions confront colonial legacies in their own spaces. The cabinets of curiosity, private gardens, museums, and institutions of wealth stained red with the legacies of slavery. In placing plants and flowers endemic to the Caribbean and Africa inside of these vitrines, Patterson displaces the traditional objects housed in the glass display cases, relegating them to the cabinets below. And you can see those cabinets that are below, and they're numbered. That's where a lot of these objects are placed. The museum's objects that have been left behind in the cases no longer serve as the focal points. Patterson obscures these markers of status and wealth by planting botanicals from the places through the ancestral bodies from which the ground derives. The flora and fauna grow atop the ground in cabinets and vitrines, thriving unchecked and unordered. What does not belong cannot survive. Patterson's museum, archival, and historical interventions are excessive. The Oxford English Dictionary defines excess as exceeding a prescribed or desirable amount, outrageous or immoderate behavior, or the action of exceeding a permitted limit. Its origins can be traced to exceed, or to pass out of boundaries, to proceed beyond a specified point, or rarely, to project beyond. It also comes from a departure, which is what I am using today. Excess considered more than necessary. When applied to the descriptor, when you apply the descriptor to a femme, black or brown body, the implication is fraught with racial markers of exclusion and difference. It is thought of as indulgent or crude. It also reflects a body out of sync with linear time, pushed to the fringes of society. The label excessive is meant to foreclose their participation in possible futures. I choose to encounter excess in its liminal state as a methodology for locating the otherwise, the opaque and unknowable, the slippery and beyond comprehension. In doing so, I take seriously Catherine McKittrick's call in Dear Science to alter the types of questions that we ask in academia and our sources of knowledge as methods to change the algorithms that are predicated on Black violence and death. Thus, excess becomes a radical framework to celebrate contradictions, slippages in experiments, life, and rebellions. In The Production of Space, Henri Lefebvre writes, quote, "The body serves both as a point of departure and a destination." And here I'm just showing some of Patterson's other works. Curator Legacy Russell theorizes that the glitched and encrypted body, which resists legibility and societal norms, and this glitched body creates ruptures and continues to replicate, which Russell refers to as, quote, "the fantastic landscapes of possibility." So I use both of these together today. And these ruptures allow the body to be a site of transformation, slippages in time and space that occur because of and through the body. In their refusal to be ignored, yet simultaneous refusal to be indexed, the bodies depicted and activated by Patterson demonstrate their right to exist and right to opacity. Excess provides us an alternative route, a pivot point toward futurity. If we look closely at and beyond this excess of her works, push through all of this clatter, clang, the dazzle, the bling, and the glitter, we can locate the futurity within her works. In their existence and movements, these bodies are simultaneously, as Russell says, somewhere and nowhere, no thing and everything. Within the lush vegetation of Patterson's tapestries and installations are carefully hidden and covered bodies, only visible by their patterned clothing in bright colors. In their excess, their excessiveness makes them temporarily hypervisible. So when I'm looking at these, McKittrick's urgent call echoes in my head and reverberates in these landscapes. And I am aware that Patterson talks about her work and discusses that in news reports. She talks about how murders in Jamaica are a source material for some of these, and I do not intend to negate or diminish her reading of her own works, but I am offering an alternative and I believe complementary reading to her works, one where death does not have to be final or death does not have to be depicted at all. I'm suggesting that Patterson's use of excess here activates the ability for her figures to escape into this liminal zone of the otherwise. And so to animate my discussion, I use what I refer to as an informal triptych of her works from the 2015 series Dead Trees, and these are the three works I'm talking about today. And so these are A View In, A View Out, and Found Among the Reeds. There are other works that are in this series as well. Locating the otherwise demands that we look beyond the flowers as beautiful, the decorative elements, just as it necessitates looking at these bodies as more than the circumstances of their death, as victims of state-sanctioned violence, murder, or neglect, and more than someone who was unknown and ignored in either life or death. 1 second. So resplendent are their turquoise, looping patterns with contrasting gold beads that glimmer in the light, and the multicolored jewel tone floral patterns at the base, from which representations of plants fantastically bloom. It is easy to momentarily miss the two figures at the center. Adorned in vibrant patterns, depicted anywhere else, they would be easily identified by their markers of excess. Patterson situates her two figures within this excessive landscape, one that refuses to be ordered, at once both celebrating the excess of these figures in land and demonstrating their radical disavowal to be known within colonial imperial constructs. The longer I look, the more I lose sight of them. They slip in and out of the viewing plane as if they were in motion within this turquoise sea that fades melodically into the background. And I spend so much time looking at this tapestry and following these figures throughout time and the landscapes that I feel compelled to imagine their names. So I'm following from Kara Keeling's work, where she talks about the aggressives, if anyone's read that, and she talks about those figures, so I do the same. So this is the figure on the left, whom I call Y. It is easier to see. Their yellow and white striped pants form a stronger contrast with the other elements in the work. These pants mark the figure's solidity across multiple works. Here, they drape the body as the figure, twist in potentially time and also space, revealing wrinkles and ripples. Y wears a black waistcoat with floral patterning, kind of blends in a bit, and has a golden hat as well. R wears a red hat and has a sleeveless striped jumpsuit that blends both into their companion and the other botanicals in the background. Their bodies are pressed tight together, as if Y has pulled R in to take a photo. Y's red-gloved hand is wrapped tightly around the torso of R, drawing them in for an embrace. I place a view out as the second in my triptych of Dead Trees tapestry narrative pieces. So Y and R are present here again, and a space forms between them in the center. Patterson has cut around this to reveal a blank space. You can see this cutting into it. There's a hole gathering around Y. They both are now posing outwardly towards us, out towards the viewer, perhaps involving us in what is happening here, or as an act of kind of documenting this transformation. So the clothing between these two works, a view in and a view out, suggests this continuity. You can see that it's still the same clothing. Much has actually changed between these two pieces. It suggests to me that Y and R have already located this otherwise, and they are in this midst of escaping. The background, previously those gentle blue loops, is now this electric pink. And Y and R have slightly different hats, so the same color schemes, but they are slightly different, and it's brighter and more decorative. The final piece, found among the reeds, acts as a coda of sorts here. The orientation signals this difference. The views are vertical and found as horizontal. When mounted, it's also typically accompanied by these silk flower petals you see on the ground, and also shoes. These are also fabricated by Patterson, suggesting that this change has occurred. The tapestry itself is divided into sections. The upper third contains those blue flowers, the bottom is pink, and within the tapestry, Y and R are, quote, missing. Yet what remains tells a story. Their hats, changed once more into what perhaps is their final form, so to speak, rest atop the tapestry. Below are hints that Y and R were here. Most puzzling is R's jumpsuit, reduced to the legs, although they appear now as if they are solid, yet hollow. Perhaps that is Patterson's intent for us to read the placement of the jumpsuit as a discarded body part dumped carelessly in the reeds. Looking for death, however, is the default. The truth is, we do not know and cannot know what happened to Y and R. They slip in and out of view, leaving only their discarded symbols of excess. The sole witness is the land, who provides echoes and resonances in her soil, requiring us to activate all our senses to listen, feel, and witness. In a catalog about Patterson's work, curator Tobias Ostrander likens the form of her tapestries to that of canvas, noting that she experiments with negative and cutaway spaces, only activated when they are hung on the gallery or museum walls. Ostrander's use of the word ground, met in the essay as a supportive material, evokes for me another meaning, as the land, where the traumas and violences can be heard echoing in the soil, where faces, stories, generations, and knowledges accumulate, where time collapses onto itself and anything and everything is truly possible. In her work with Black quantum futurism, artist and writer Rashida Phillips reminds us that the word time has roots in Taidez, a Sanskrit word meaning division or to cut up. Time can be divided or cut in terms of units and measurement, but the act of cutting in terms of creates these slippages and can be associated with a refusal to participate in a linear temporality that privileges order and legibility. Patterson's act of cutting and pasting in her tapestries and installation works creates these slippages that not only serve as visual references to the past and present, but refuse to conform to the notion of a linear and grounded temporality. And they posit this future or other world. If we assume that Y and R are alive and that their story has many possible ends, there is an obvious question that follows. However, I will not ask that question. And as I said, I take my cue from Kara Keeling to ask when R and Y might be. This distinction privileges care over surveillance, but also allows for futurity. Each vitrine and drawer within Patterson's Buried Again to Carry On Growing carries an echo or refrain reminiscent of their syntax of the book of poetry that inspired its title, Olive Senior's Gardening in the Tropics. Senior's book consists of 12 poems, each beginning with the line, "Gardening in the tropics, you never know what you'll turn up." What follows is a literary exploration of the complex history of the Caribbean as told through the space of the home garden. In Brief Lives, the unnamed narrator continues, quite often bones. The latest was of a young man from the country who lost his way and crossed the invisible boundary into rival political territory. I buried him again so he can carry on growing. Here, too, we find the slippages and ruptures, the departures and arrivals. The young man in Senior's poem is transported from the words of her book to Patterson's installation, shrouded to provide cover while he grows. Patterson includes plants that can be used for survival, both for care and violence. And I've highlighted here just one. This is called Zanzibar spectacle. Known as beehive ginger in Europe and the United States, it's primarily an ornamental plant. However, its name holds special meaning if we look closer. Spectacle is derived from Latin, meaning visible, remarkable, admirable, showy, and spectacular. One goal of excess is to be seen, but Patterson's blinged out, heavily patterned, and ornate bodies also possess the ability to slip away, emotionally, mentally, or physically. Space and time are not static. They're not predetermined and transparent categories. They are infinite, in flux, and opaque constructs with permeable boundaries. Through her use of excess, Patterson refuses to adhere to the notion of space and time as discrete elements. Her work demands that we consider the infinite, the future, the when and not the where, and it is precisely in these slippages that futurity can be accessed. Put differently, they are free. Thank you.
So I invite all our speakers from the first session to come up. Thank you for these 3 amazing papers. Wow. You gave us so much to think about. And I want to start by trying to just pull out some of the themes. And, you know, the themes, so many common, you know, sort of commonalities between the second and third papers. But I noticed that all 3 dealt with bodies in space, that they all in some way dealt with themes of visibility and invisibility. And maybe all three even dealt with excess in a way, but I don't know. We can try to come to that. So I'm going to ask questions of each of you in the order in which the papers were presented, and then and open it up for discussion and questions from the audience, also from people online. Please type your questions into the chat. And I also encourage the three of you to talk to each other and ask questions of each other. Okay, so Ella, I think that, I thought that that was just such a beautiful reconstructing and imagining of that site. And as you said, kind of bringing together these things that we think about separately and just as fragments, and kind of making them whole again, and helping us to understand how these pieces of sculpture functioned in the sanctuary, interacted with each other. I think my question is about what sort of the ideas of labor at the time that these things were created. Do we know what the society out of which these came thought about labor? Like, were the things that were the types of labor that are being depicted here, were they considered labor? Does that have to do with their invisibility? And I also wonder about the sort of relationship between, like, female labor and female sacrifice. Because there are a lot of themes of sacrifice going on too, and is there a difference?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. That's wonderful. So to start with the first one, in terms of ideas of labor during the time that these were created. So there's sort of kind of conflicting and sort of paradoxical versions and interpretations of labor that I would say. I think in some ancient texts, it's viewed as kind of quite like a pejorative thing that is sort of only reserved for a certain kind of lower class of individual. But then, on the other hand, we also have these texts that are sort of praising labor, praising, worship and sort of service to the gods. So I think it's, in a way, yeah, a bit difficult to kind of categorize and grasp, and it's certainly something as well that I need to sort of delve deeper into as well. And I'll say also with women's labor in particular, something that has been really helpful for me to look at is sort of comparisons and looking at what women are doing on like attic vase painting, and seeing how sort of that adds like another layer in perspective. And in terms of artistic labor in particular, we have texts that sort of mention women artists, but none of their works survive. Yet we have sort of depictions on vase painting of women painting pots or in workshop settings. So I guess to sort of summarize, we have kind of sort of various conceptions of labor, and in terms of our artistic labor in particular, not a really clear sense of it. And then in terms of the relationship between female labor and female sacrifice, that's a really wonderful point that you brought up, and that I don't necessarily touch on explicitly, but I would say that absolutely that this sacrifice is sort of embedded in that labor, and is something that I need to sort of explore more. Thank you.
Thank you. And then there's also the labor. I wonder if it's thought of as labor again, or and sacrifice, the work of the oracle herself.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. So Hilde, that was incredible. It was such a great reading of formal reading of the film, and connecting it to really breaking it down for us and connecting it to the work that the actual film does to push against scopic control. And I really like the way that both of you were pushing against the assumption that that which is seen as the totality of something. Like thinking about, as you both said, the unrepresented. It's really powerful. And Hilde, I really like the way that you ended, because the whole time that you were talking, I was getting ready to ask about the relationship between the sort of immateriality of the film and the physicality of the things in the space. So the altars, but also the frames on top of the screen, the inscription on the film, and also the tilting, like just all these sort of physical interventions. The tilting of the screens is also another kind of like intervention, right? But then, sort of talking about these things as, what did you say? Like allowing the film to spill out. I thought that made a lot of sense. It was really, really convincing, really powerful. But I guess so my question is just sort of like, can you, would you say more about that, the relationship between the material and the immaterial in her work?
Sure. Well, I guess I would start by saying, too, that I think part of what I'm always wrestling with or wanting to think about in terms of time-based media, right, especially in thinking about the digital or video, right, is it's often characterized as dematerialized or immaterial, but it's always material. It's a medium that is tied to materiality still, and is always in tension. And even in talking about, the direct animation where she's, scratching on or animating on the celluloid, which is a technique probably most associated with people like Len Lai or Stan Brakhage. So it's got a sort of lineage in experimental filmmaking. But even that, right, what we see projected on the screen is it's been converted to digital. So there's always kind of a tension between the analog and the digital in the very film itself. But then in thinking about the relationship to the installation space, and to be clear, like I said, my interpretation is based off having seen it at MoMA. It's also been installed at the Hammer Museum in LA, and I think I was just reading that it's going to be at the Block Museum in Chicago. So I think she's kind of been changing it as it's been installed in different iterations. But yes, I think that is a huge part of the play of it, right, of the experiencing it in space, and that's part of why I wanted to caution that, like, me looking at the viewing copy is missing aspects of how you would experience it. You might have been able to tell, especially in the clip I included that was kind of the breakdown of the screen, that because the central channel is covered in white frames, so it's always a little, when you see it in person, it's always a little distorted, like there's always kind of a ripple happening on the screen. The fact that the two side channels are set at oblique angles, all of it is a little bit resistant to an easy reading of the image. And so I think, I guess to your question about like how to balance that, most of her video installations include some kind of sculptural element, whether it's neon lights or she had a video, Quiet as It's Kept, which was in dialogue with Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, that had an installation element that was a fridge kind of overflowing with marigolds, which is a reference to the novel. So I think that's a huge aspect of it for her, is thinking about film and video as always sort of in dialogue with the material elements, that they're not inseparable. And I think you could go down a total rabbit hole of thinking about like the labor of them, the ecological impact of them, and there are plenty of people doing that work. So I think it's all part and parcel, and hopefully that got a little bit of your question.
Thank you. And Nikki, such a great paper. I love your reframing of excess as really as a strategy, as a refusal to be known, a refusal to behave in a certain way. I think it's powerful. I think my what I would ask you to do, and I'm giving you the hardest question, I think, which is I want to ask you to engage with Hilde. And because there's so many things. Different media, different artists, obviously, different ways of kind of getting at the other words and excess, but so many like commonalities, like even the triptych sort of idea, the use of nature. So, could I ask you to comment on, or I don't know, just sort of, what did Hilde's paper bring up for you and your own work?
Yes, I can do that, because we were discussing before that they have a lot of residences, and I showed you only Patterson's work today, but the other part that I talk about in this broader chapter is about Firle Baez. So I talk broadly about other works as well, so I can do that. But we both talk about the glitch, so that was fascinating. What I was really interested in is when you were talking about the idea of out of field as something else in the otherwise. So that is not something that I have used because I don't do a lot with video practice. So I'm interested in learning more about that in particular. And also, if you had any more on the, if you could talk about that and the hypervisible and how that plays into it, because we both talk a lot about that. And I know we're only talking for a few minutes, so we didn't have time to put all of that in, but I think that is where we have a lot of commonalities. And I want to know more. I'm very curious about that out of field as being into the otherwise, because I don't know a lot about it. And I want to include that in my work.
Oh, yeah, sure. Okay, what order to do this in? Yeah, so the out of field's actually funny that you mentioned Kara Keeling, because I was very inspired by Kara Keeling's book, The Witch's Flight, which is thinking about the black femme in film is primarily what she's dealing with, and it's a chapter on the movie Set It Off, if you've ever seen it. It's a good movie, you should see it. And what she's talking about is there's Queen Latifah's character, Cleo, her girlfriend, Ursula, and using that to think about like what Ursula's inner life is, because we barely see, she's barely in the film, and I think has one line, maybe, if that, I can't remember. And so she sort of uses it as a reading to think about like how capacious Ursula's world is beyond what we see on the screen. And so that got me thinking about like where does someone go, you know, when they're not on the screen. There's a clip I cut for time here, but one of the things that she includes in the Josephine Baker material is there's a moment where she gets out of the birdcage and like leaps into this row of men waiting to catch her. It's very like musical theater. But in the moment that she leaps, Jatavia cuts, and there's a stream of plant matter, which is kind of a recurring motif. And then it cuts back to her landing in the arms. And I always thought that was so interesting of like, there's a moment where she's gone, and where did she jump into? So that's how I was thinking about it, is that the screen, and I mean, I don't have time to go into the entire history of film theory, but like I think that there's something to be said about the way that we engage with the screen as a boundary, and how that's part of why I was so interested in the use of like the altars and thinking about what is outside of it and how could that be a space of potential. And then to your other question about the invisibility, hypervisibility, a lot of that came from, so the inception of this project was Jatavia received a Terra Foundation grant to work in Giverny in 2016. And she describes that experience as feeling, you know, as a Black woman in rural France, feeling both invisible and hypervisible that was her phrasing. And she was there when Philando Castile was murdered by police at a traffic stop. And so that image was the Diamond Reynolds video was circulating really widely that summer. And she talks about it as like, I think I might be misquoting her, but you know, like her double consciousness was profoundly provoked, or, you know, so I think that that's part of what I find interesting about the whole tension here and what I wanted to explore. And I think what you're thinking about too is, I think a lot about, there's a Peggy Phelan quote of visibility is a trap. And I think that's really true here, that visibility can offer a lot for people in terms of like presence and recognition, but it can also lay them open to surveillance and exploitation. And so how I think that like that tension is at the heart of this work, and I don't know that it's resolvable, but that's why these are all sort of attempts or tries, and I think that that's really valuable. And maybe that's where the out of field is so interesting to me too, because it's so capacious in what it could be. So.
And then this is for any of you. Can we connect these themes of invisibility and visibility to Ella's paper? Ella, I mean, how is this? Is this
I
bringing
wrote down a
stuff
note.
for you? Yeah.
I did, because I caught that we do have that shared theme. And also because you talked about the invisible nature of labor, but I was also thinking about the ideas of labor and craft, because you know, Patterson is making tapestries, and those are thought of as craft in a way, and that's very much separated from the idea of high art in a way, you know, the idea of sewing, weaving, so the idea of what is kind of craft versus, you know, other forms of art. You mentioned craft and labor, and so those kind of themes are something, but I think the invisible nature of labor is definitely one thing that connects our three papers, definitely, beyond just the idea of bodies.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. And I'm glad that you brought up this labor-craft relationship, and I also think about it in relation to, you know, women weaving in antiquity, and that being sort of a major contribution and form of labor, yet we don't have any of those textiles, because they don't survive. So again, we have this like another layer of invisibility, and I think sort of one of my goals with the Caryatids is, even though like they're very conspicuous in terms of that they show, you know, women holding up a building, they're doing this very obvious form of labor, yet they're also, you know, we don't really notice them. They're kind of invisible. And one of the wonderful things about this project is once I started researching Caryatids, I kind of see them everywhere, even on modern buildings, which I think is so cool and wonderful. And I think kind of using this, to me, very, very visible and obvious form of women's labor to sort of excavate other ones that might not survive is an interesting and neat thing to do.
Thank you so much. So I will open it up to questions, comments. And okay, thank you. Great. I was just going to say, please do wait for the microphone so that people online can hear you.
Yeah. So thank you all for a tremendous panel. It was so fabulous, and I loved all the resonances between your papers. I have questions for all three of you. So first, Ella. So I have a question about, you mentioned briefly the oracle, the Pythia. What what depictions do we have in the ancient world of oracles? Are there any? And I don't know, to what extent do they compare with the images of the statuary you were showing? I'd just love to hear a little bit more about that, making those connections or contrast. And then for Hilde, I wanted to ask about the relevance of the clothing in the videos you were showing, especially what Gary is wearing. In terms of the flowered dress, it's it sort of evokes the garden setting, but it doesn't really blend in. It's kind of stands out. And then also that drone footage where she's walking, maybe it's a stretch, but it kind of looks like she's wearing a jacket that looks sort of like a early 19th century French military soldier. Like I said, maybe a stretch, but, what is the potential role or commentary that clothing plays in your reading of of this work? And for Nikki, what I was detecting like this interesting tension in your paper between the theme of excess and camouflage blending in, and those concepts seem like they are in contrast to each other, that they're in tension with one another, but it seems like you're trying to kind of find a way between the two of them. So if you could just talk a little bit more about that, that would be great. Thank you so much.
Sure, I can begin. First, thank you so much for your questions. Those were wonderful. In terms of depictions of the oracle in antiquity, to my knowledge, it's only one of the first ones that I showed of the Pythia sitting on a tripod in that vase painting is the only known depiction in antiquity.
All oracles?
Oh, of all oracles. I don't think of all oracles, no, but for the Pythia in particular, yeah, that's the only depiction that survives, at least. And in terms of the second question, to what extent do these depictions compare to statues? That's a good question, and I don't have a solid answer for that right now. It's something I would need to reflect on a little deeper. Do you mean in terms of statues of Caryatids, or just sort of broadly?
I was mostly just thinking about, these are just, as Martha was bringing up, these are also images of women at work.
Right.
And so just thinking about contrasting and comparing those images. And like I said, it wasn't, not necessarily just the Pythia, but just images of oracles in general.
Yeah, to be quite honest, I'm not entirely sure. I'd have to sort of look into that a little bit more deeply. In terms of how they compare to other images of women at work, I guess sort of my kind of superficial and quick answer would be that they're super kind of engaged in the task, sort of enveloped in it, which is something that I see sort of with images of women weaving, for example. But yeah, I would need to look into this more. But I really appreciate your question. Thank you.
Yeah, so in terms of how Gary herself appears in the video, my understanding is that she sees them as sort of characters. So when she's in the garden, I believe she calls that like La Negresse, which this video has kind of been iterative. It's a 40-minute video that's incredibly dense, so also I could be here for this entire time talking about everything that happens. But so the segments where she's in the garden was originally part of a 6-minute video called La Negresse, Negresse 1, Giverny. And I think in that one, what's interesting for me is not even just, yes, the floral dress,
but also there's a portion where she is recumbent in the nude, and I think it's the black choker that I find very interesting, because to me that immediately evokes Olympia, and a very different kind of body, and also obviously a painting that is rife with questions and tensions about race. And so that to me is the illusion that I see there most strongly. And then in terms of how she appears walking through Central Park, that's also tying that footage. I didn't really get to talk about it, but there's a huge segment of the video that's her conducting interviews in Harlem with Black women, teens, and girls. And it's a reference to this 1961 French film called Chronicles of a Summer. It's considered the first cinema verite film, where they ask people in Paris, "Are you happy?" But she transforms the question to, "Do you feel safe, like in your body, in the world?" And so I think that and a lot of that segment is thinking about like appearance in terms of dressing in baggy clothes, being followed. And so I think there are connections, because that's, again, a kind of, each one of those is another instantiation of appearance in different kinds of situations and milieus. So that's how I sort of see the cladding as engaging with these questions.
Thank you for your lovely question, Emily. In the interest of time, I will just answer really briefly. Patterson wants to draw people into these beautiful landscapes and gardenscapes, so she has this tension of these very excessive, beautiful scenes and these excessive kind of clothing. So yes, there is definitely that tension happening there, where they are hidden in the scene, and then once you come closer, you can see them appear. So that tension is there. I think that contradictions can exist. So this idea of not only but. So I let them live in there, and I talk about that further kind of throughout my entire dissertation, that this exists, and I let that be. I don't try to tease that out further necessarily. It's okay that these contradictions can exist. And so yeah, there definitely is one that lives there, where things can be excessive, things can be visible, invisible, and hypervisible, kind of all at once. But you were absolutely correct that things are both excessive and camouflaged in a way, and that is by design with these works. I can answer further after this. I just want to be mindful of the fact that I know a lot of people had questions.
And I know it's time for lunch, but I do want to allow time for one more question, Kaylin, so you choose.
God, this is stressful. I'm just going to go to the other side of the room.
Thank you all so much for your wonderful talks. I have a question for Ella, and then I have questions for y'all afterwards when we have more time. But kind of tying your overall concern for contemporary reconstructions and uses of classical imagery in the 21st century, I'm really curious, once you kind of found that Assassin's Creed image of this temple and the Caryatids who are half naked, not holding any kind of, devotive object. How do you read that, and how does that thwart the kind of feminist and female-centered, invisible labor-centered history that you're trying to reconstruct?
Thank you so much for that question. That's fantastic. I will say my advisor actually made me aware of this image, so I thank her very much for it. In terms of how I see this, or how I read this, and how it could, thwart this sort of feminist lens that I'm trying to take, I guess it is sort of like just this kind of like fantastical reimagining of this that I do think is, somewhat rooted in antiquity, but then at the same time, this is a video game, so trying to, kind of make that, palatable, and I'm not sure relatable is the quite the right word that I want to use, but I don't know, sort of interesting for kind of a broader public, and maybe this is one of the ways that you do that. I'm not quite sure, but yeah, I need to think on that question a little more, but it's fantastic, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. Let's go have some lunch. We can continue talking, and we'll be back at 1.